Imagine waking up in a cold stone room as the first grey light bleeds through a shutter. Your stomach growls. You stumble toward the kitchen expecting, what, eggs, toast, coffee? None of those things exist for you. Not yet. Not here. Instead, you're handed a wooden bowl of ale soup, yesterday's bread soaked in warm beer, sometimes with a handful of herbs floating on top if you're lucky. You lift the spoon. It smells like fermented grain and wet wool. You eat it anyway because this is breakfast in the Middle Ages and you probably won't survive the day without it. Welcome to the strangest culinary journey. You've never asked for a 2-hour dive into the meals that medieval people actually ate, not the sanitized feasts you see in movies. We're talking blood puddings for breakfast live birds baked into pies, and theological debates about whether dolphins count as fish. This isn't a cooking show. This is survival superstition, and occasionally sheer audacity on a plate. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love knowing there's someone in Tokyo having their morning coffee, while someone in Ohio is drifting off to sleep to the same voice. We're all in this medieval meal together. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in a medieval kitchen before dawn. The fire hasn't been stoked yet. The air smells like old smoke and damp stone. Breakfast isn't about pleasure, it's about function. The word itself, break fast, tells you everything. You're breaking the fast of sleep, refueling the body so it can work until the sun sets again. For most people, the labourers, the farmers, the endless masses of the working poor, the first meal is pottage, but not the pottage you'll eat later. This is thinner, almost drinkable, made from whatever grain survived the winter. Barley, rye, oats if you're fortunate. You pour it into a cup and drink it while standing because sitting down to eat implies leisure, and leisure is for the wealthy. If you're a peasant, you might also get a chunk of dark bread, not the soft fluffy kind. This bread is dense, gritty, sometimes mixed with ground peas or acorns when the harvest was bad. You tear off a piece and chew it slowly because your teeth aren't great. Nobody's teeth are great, and because this bread will keep you full longer than anything else you'll eat today. Now, if you're part of the noble class, your breakfast looks different. You still wake up cold, but someone else has already lit your fire. A servant brings you a small meal, a slice of cold meat pie from last night's supper, a cup of wine, maybe a piece of marchpane if you're trying to impress guests. You eat it in bed because you can, because your body doesn't have to be in a field by sunrise. But here's where it gets strange. For a long time, eating a large breakfast was considered suspicious, gluttonous even. The church frowned upon it. Morning was for prayer, not feasting. If you stuffed yourself at dawn, people assumed you were weak-willed, indulgent, maybe even sinful. Historians still argue whether this was about genuine piety or just a convenient way for the church to control behaviour, but either way the message stuck. A modest breakfast meant a disciplined soul. So the ale soup, the thin pottage, the single piece of bread that wasn't just poverty, it was also virtue. And let's talk about that ale soup for a second, because it sounds bizarre until you understand the context. Water in medieval Europe was often unsafe. Rivers were sewage channels, wells were contaminated, but ale was boiled during the brewing process, which killed most of the harmful bacteria. It was also caloric. Liquid bread, essentially. So soaking stale bread in warm ale wasn't laziness, it was smart. You were hydrating, eating, and getting a tiny bit of alcohol to dull the edges of a brutal existence all in one bowl. Some mornings, especially in winter, you'd get blood pudding. Freshly slaughtered animals meant fresh blood and nothing could be wasted. The blood was mixed with fat oats, and herbs stuffed into intestines and cooked. You sliced it thick and ate it with your hands. It tasted like iron and survival. It kept you warm. Children ate a version of this too, though theirs was sometimes sweetened with honey if the family could afford it. Honey was medicine, preservative, and treat all at once. A spoonful in a child's morning pottage could mean the difference between a kid who worked all day and a kid who collapsed by noon. You finish your bowl. You wipe your mouth on your sleeve. The sun is barely up and already you've consumed something that would make a modern person gag. But you don't think about it. This is food. This is life. You'll eat stranger things before the day is done. You've made it through breakfast. Now imagine you're invited to a noble feast, not as a guest, but as a servant. You're standing in the kitchen watching the cooks prepare something that looks less like a meal and more like a resurrection. They're roasting a peacock. But here's the thing, they're not just roasting it. They're performing culinary taxidermy. First, they carefully skin the bird, keeping every iridescent feather intact. Then they roast the naked body on a spit, basting it with butter and wine, until the meat turns golden. Finally, and this is where it gets theatrical, they sew the cooked peacock back into its own feathered skin, prop it upright on a silver platter, and gild its beak with gold leaf. Your job: carry this Frankenstein bird into the great hall without letting the head flop over. Welcome to the world of dressed birds where food was spectacle, and every dish told a story about wealth power, and honestly a little bit of insecurity. Because when you're a medieval lord trying to impress rival nobles, you don't just serve dinner, you stage a performance. And nothing said, "I have more money than sense," quite like a peacock that looked alive but tasted like dry poultry. The tradition came from ancient Rome, where exotic birds were status symbols. Medieval Europe inherited the obsession and cranked it up. Peacocks were expensive to keep, they ate, constantly screamed at dawn, and served no practical purpose, which made them perfect. Useless beauty was the ultimate flex. Swans got the same treatment. Roasted, refeathered, sometimes posed mid-flight with wires holding their wings open. Herons too, though historians still argue whether anyone actually enjoyed eating heron or if it was purely about the visual. The meat was fishy tough and required heavy spicing to mask the flavour. But when that heron arrived at the table with its long neck curved gracefully and its plumage shimmering in candlelight, nobody cared how it tasted. You, the servant, are sweating now. The peacock weighs more than you expected, and the kitchen heat has softened the fat holding some feathers in place. One tail plume droops. The cook glares at you. You adjust your grip and walk faster. In the great hall, guests gasp as you enter. The peacock gleams. Someone claps. A musician starts playing. This is dinner as theatre, and you're part of the cast, unpaid, exhausted, and praying you don't trip. Here's a detail they don't tell you in history books: these birds were often served cold. By the time the kitchen finished the refeathering process, the meat had cooled completely. Nobles ate it anyway, slicing through the sewn skin with knives, pretending the lukewarm flesh was delicious. Because admitting otherwise would ruin the illusion, and illusion was everything. Sometimes, for extra drama, cooks stuffed the bird's beak with cotton soaked in alcohol, then lit it on fire as servants carried it in. A flaming peacock. Because why not? If you're already spending a fortune on feathers and gold leaf, a little pyrotechnics just completes the aesthetic, the strangest part. This wasn't rare. Recipe books from the 14th and 15th centuries are full of instructions for dressing birds. They discuss which thread works best for sewing skin, how to reinforce neck bone so the head stays upright, and which spices mask the taste of meat that's been handled way too much. One recipe suggests inserting a smaller roasted bird inside the peacock before sewing it shut, a culinary nesting doll. You'd carve through the peacock to reveal a goose, then carve the goose to find a chicken. Historians call this engastration. Medieval lords called it a good Saturday night. But let's be real, the cooks were the real artist here. They worked in scalding kitchens, handled raw meat and live fire, and had to make a dead bird look photo shoot ready before Instagram even existed. And if the feathers fell off mid-presentation, that was your fault, not theirs. You, the servant, took the blame. You set the peacock down on the high table. The lord nods approvingly. His guests murmur compliments. Someone makes a joke about the bird looking better now than it did alive. Everyone laughs. You back away slowly, careful not to disturb the scene. In the corner, a hunting dog gnaws on a swan bone from the previous course. The musician transitions into a softer melody. The candles flicker. And you think this is what they'll remember. Not the taste, the image, the feathers, the fire, the sheer absurdity of eating something that looked like it might still fly away. You've survived the peacock spectacle. Now let's talk about something even stranger, something that killed a king and nearly started a war. Lampreys. If you've never seen a lamprey, imagine an eel designed by a horror movie director. No jaw, just a circular mouth lined with concentric rows of teeth. It latches onto fish rasps through their scales with that tooth-studded tongue and sucks their blood. It's a parasite, a living nightmare that swims, and medieval nobility couldn't get enough of them. You're standing beside a river in early spring watching fishermen haul in their catch. Most of it is ordinary trout, pike, salmon. But then someone shouts they've caught lampreys, not one or two, a dozen writhing in the net like furious shoelaces. The fishermen are excited because these aren't just fish, these are currency. Lampreys were so valuable that entire rivers were monitored for them. Towns paid taxes in lamprey. Royal courts demanded them as tribute. If you caught a particularly fat one, you didn't eat it yourself, you sent it to someone important, and hoped they'd remember your generosity. King Henry I of England loved lampreys so much that according to chroniclers he ate a surfeit of them in 1135 and died shortly after. His doctors had warned him. Lampreys were rich, fatty, difficult to digest. But Henry didn't care. He kept eating, and his stomach gave out. Historians still argue whether the lampreys actually killed him, or if he just had terrible timing with a pre-existing condition, but the story stuck. The king who died for eel. You'd think that would scare people off. It didn't. If anything, it made lampreys more desirable. If a king would risk death for them, they must be extraordinary. So how did people prepare these toothy horrors? Carefully. First, you had to keep them alive until the last possible moment because dead lampreys spoiled fast. You kept them in barrels of river water, sometimes for days, watching them coil and twist. Then right before cooking, you'd kill them quickly, usually by slicing behind the head, and bleed them out. The blood was part of the appeal. It was thick, almost gelatinous, and when mixed with wine and spices it became a sauce. You'd poach the lamprey in this blood wine mixture, then serve it in slices dripping with the dark red glaze. It looked medieval. It tasted like iron salt and deep water. Some people loved it, others gagged. But here's where it gets political. Lamprey pies became diplomatic gifts. If you wanted to butter up a rival lord or congratulate a bishop, you sent him a lamprey pie. Not just any pie, a carefully constructed one sealed with pastry, packed with spiced lamprey, and that blood sauce designed to survive a 3-day journey without spoiling. Every Christmas, the city of Gloucester sent a lamprey pie to the reigning monarch. This wasn't optional. It was tradition, obligation, a way of saying, we still acknowledge your authority, and also we're really good at catching lamprey. The tradition continued for centuries. Even into the 20th century, Gloucester tried to revive it for royal occasions, though by then, Lampreys had become rare, and the whole thing felt more like historical reenactment than genuine cuisine. You're back in the medieval kitchen now, watching a cook assemble one of these pies. The lamprey pieces are arranged in a spiral packed tightly so nothing shifts during transport. The blood sauce is poured over thick enough to coat every piece. Then the pastry lid is sealed with egg wash and crimped shut. It'll be baked, slowly cooled and wrapped in cloth. Somewhere a noble is waiting for this pie. He'll receive it with ceremony, slice it open in front of guests and pretend he's thrilled, even if he secretly finds lamprey disgusting. Because refusing a lamprey pie wasn't just rude, it was politically unwise. One medieval writer described lampreys as having a taste that clings to memory. He didn't specify if that was a good thing. Another called them the fish of kings and the doom of the greedy. That one was definitely a warning. But the obsession persisted. Recipes evolved. Some cooks added figs, others ginger. A few experimental kitchens tried honey. None of it changed the fundamental truth you were eating a blood-sucking parasite because someone somewhere decided it was fancy. You watch the pie disappear into the oven. The cook wipes his hands and mutters something about how the Lord better appreciate this because lampreys are getting harder to find and twice as expensive. Outside, the river flows on lampreyless for now. Inside, the pie bakes, filling the kitchen with the smell of spiced blood and ambition. You've made it through blood-sucking eels. Now let's talk about a loophole so audacious that it let monks eat dolphins and call it holy. Picture this, you're a Benedictine monk in a coastal monastery. It's Lent. For the next 40 days you're forbidden from eating meat. No beef, no pork, no chicken. The rules are clear. Your abbot is watching. God presumably is also watching. But you're hungry. And yesterday a porpoise washed up on the beach. So you ask yourself a very medieval question. Is a porpoise meat, or is it fish? The answer according to the church was fish. Dolphins, porpoises, whales, seals. Anything that lived in water was classified as fish, regardless of whether it breathed air, nursed its young, or had a four-chambered heart. The logic was simple. If deeply flawed, cold-blooded creatures were meat, warm-blooded creatures were meat, but anything in the ocean was made by God on the 5th day of creation, which meant it belonged to the category of fish. Therefore you could eat it during Lent. Historians still argue whether church authorities genuinely believed this, or if they were just pragmatic about coastal communities needing protein. Either way, the ruling stuck. Monks ate dolphin, nobles ate porpoise, and everyone pretended it was the same as eating cod. You're standing on that beach now watching fishermen butcher the porpoise. It's massive, several hundred pounds of blubber and muscle. They work quickly, slicing through the thick skin, separating meat from fat. The smell is overwhelming, marine, slightly sweet. Nothing like beef, but nothing like fish either. The meat is dark red, almost purple. It bleeds like land animals bleed. One of the fishermen jokes that it looks more like venison than mackerel. Another mutters a prayer just in case the classification is wrong and they're all going to hell for this. But the church had spoken. Porpoise was fish. And if the church said it, it must be true. Back in the monastery kitchen, the cook prepares the porpoise like he would any expensive meat. He cuts it into steaks, each one thick and dense. He seasons them with pepper, ginger, and salt expensive spices, because this is technically a feast day meal even during Lent. Then he roasts them slowly over a low fire, basting them with their own fat. The fat is incredible. It renders down into a clear oil that the monastery will save for everything from lamp fuel to leather conditioning. Nothing is wasted. The bones go into stock. The blubber becomes tallow. Even the skin gets boiled down for glue. You sit in the refectory with the other monks. The porpoise arrives on wooden platters still steaming. The abbot says a blessing. You cut into your portion. It's tender rich, and yes, it tastes like meat. It tastes exactly like meat. Your mind screams, this is meat, but your theology says this is fish, and somehow you have to reconcile the two while chewing. One of the older monks leans over and whispers that in his village they used to call porpoise sea pork. You nearly choke. Sea pork, during Lent. The irony is almost too much. But this wasn't just a monastic quirk. Nobles loved the loophole too. Dolphin meat became a delicacy at Lenten feasts. Recipe books from the 14th century include instructions for preparing pisci magnus, great fish, which was code for whale or dolphin. One recipe suggests boiling dolphin in wine with onions and serving it cold in its own jelly. Another recommends roasting it on a spit like lamb. Seals got the same treatment. In northern regions where seals were abundant, they were hunted specifically for Lent. The meat was tough, fishy, and required heavy spicing, but it was protein and it was technically allowed. Some monasteries kept detailed records of their Lenten meals, and seal appears again and again, roasted seal, boiled seal, seal pie. Beavers were another edge case. They spent time in water. They had flat, scaly tails. Some theologians argue that the tail at least counted as fish, so during Lent you could eat beaver tail and stay within the rules. The rest of the beaver was debatable, but the tail that was definitely fish. You finish your porpoise steak. It sits heavy in your stomach. Outside, the ocean continues its rhythm indifferent to taxonomy. Somewhere a dolphin swims past the monastery, unaware that its cousin just became dinner, under the technicality of being cold-blooded. The abbot stands and dismisses the meal with a prayer. You file out of the refectory, still tasting the sea pork that wasn't pork, thinking about how thin the line is between sin and supper, how much depends on who gets to draw that line, and how a porpoise, warm-blooded, air-breathing intelligent became a fish, because the alternative was 40 days of hunger. You've eaten theologically questionable dolphins. Now let's talk about pies that sing. You're at a banquet. The meal has been going for hours. You've watched jugglers listen to musicians, applauded dancers. Your stomach is full, but not satisfied. Medieval feasts aren't about satisfaction, they're about endurance. And just when you think the spectacle can't escalate further, the servants carry in an enormous pie. It's the size of a small table. The crust is golden, elaborately decorated with pastry flowers and braided edges. Steam rises from the vents. Everyone goes quiet. The Lord stands. A servant approaches with a knife. He cuts the lid, and 24 live blackbirds explode into the air. Welcome to the entertainment pie, a culinary magic trick that was equal parts impressive and deranged. These weren't real pies in the sense of food you'd actually eat. They were edible theatre hollow crusts designed to hide living creatures until the dramatic reveal. Birds were the most common choice, but ambitious cooks also used rabbits, frogs, even small dogs if they were feeling particularly chaotic. Here's how it worked. The pastry was baked empty sometimes around a wooden frame to keep its shape. Once cooled, the bottom was carefully removed, or a trapdoor was cut. Live birds were placed inside gently because you needed them, energetic but not panicked, and the lid was sealed with raw dough that hadn't been baked. From the outside it looked like a normal pie. From the inside it was a temporary aviary. You can imagine the kitchen chaos. Birds chirping in their hidden chamber. Cooks checking the seal every few minutes to make sure nothing escaped early. Timing was everything. If the pie sat too long, the birds might suffocate. If it arrived too cold, the reveal lacked impact. The bird pie had to hit the table at exactly the right moment. Still faintly warm, still structurally sound, still full of living surprises. The tradition came from a much older idea that banquets should astonish. Medieval nobles competed over who could produce the most memorable feast and memory-required spectacle. Food that just tasted good wasn't enough. It had to move, transform, surprise. The bird pie did all three. One Italian cookbook from the 1400s describes a version using multiple layers, a large pie containing a medium pie containing a small pie, each filled with different creatures. You'd cut the first crust to release doves, cut the second to release quail, cut the third to find finally actual food. It was a culinary nesting doll, except everything was alive and increasingly frantic. You're back in that banquet hall watching blackbirds careen around the rafters. Some guests laugh, others duck. A few birds land on the table and start pecking at leftover bread. One poops on a countess's sleeve. She smiles tightly because showing annoyance would be admitting the spectacle worked too well. The most famous reference to this practice is the nursery rhyme. Sing a song of sixpence, a pocket full of rye, 24 blackbirds baked in a pie. Everyone knows the rhyme. Most people assume it's nonsense, but it's not. It's a direct description of entertainment pies preserved in verse, because the practice was common enough that even children knew about it. Historians still argue about how widespread this actually was. Some say it happened only at the grandest courts. Others point to account books showing purchases of live birds specifically for pie purposes at middle-tier noble houses. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Not every feast had a bird pie, but enough did that the idea spread across Europe and became part of the cultural imagination. Sometimes the reveals got more elaborate. One French banquet featured a giant pie that, when opened, revealed a dwarf dressed as a knight, who climbed out, recited a poem, and challenged guests to a mock duel. Another had a pie containing a small orchestra of musicians crammed inside with miniature instruments, who began playing the moment the crust was cut. But let's talk about what happened after the reveal. The birds, having served their purpose, were now loose in the hall. Most flew toward the windows and escaped. Some got caught by hunting dogs. A few were recaptured by servants and presumably used in the next entertainment pie, because why waste a perfectly good blackbird and the pie itself? The crust was sometimes eaten waste, but more often it was discarded or given to servants. It had been handled extensively, filled with bird droppings, and was structurally compromised. It wasn't food anymore, it was a prop. You watch the final blackbird disappear through an open shutter. The hall settles. Musicians resume playing. Servants clear away the hollow crust, and within minutes the next course arrives, an actual pie, this time filled with meat and gravy, blessedly free of live animals. But you'll remember the bird pie longer, because it wasn't about taste. It was about the gasp, the chaos, the moment when dinner became something impossible. You've watched birds escape from pies. Now let's talk about plates you can eat, or at least plates someone else will eat after you're done with them. You're sitting at a medieval table. There's no ceramic dish in front of you, no pewter plate. Instead, there's a thick slab of stale bread, roughly square, about 4 inches across and an inch thick. This is your trencher. It's your plate, your napkin, and eventually your moral statement. Welcome to the world of edible dishware, where class hierarchy was visible in what you ate off of and who got to eat it afterward. Trenchers weren't fancy bread. They were made from coarse wheat or rye, baked days earlier, until they were hard enough to hold liquids without immediately dissolving. You didn't eat them during the meal, not if you had any manners. You piled food on top: stew, roasted meat, thick sauces. The bread soaked up the grease and juices, becoming progressively softer and more flavourful as the meal went on. If you were wealthy, you had servants who replaced your trencher between courses, a fresh piece of bread for each new dish. The used trenchers piled up on a side table, growing into a soggy, gravy-soaked tower that represented both your appetite and your waste. If you were poor, you had one trencher for the entire meal. You ate carefully, trying not to let it disintegrate before you finished. And at the end, if you were still hungry, which you probably were, you ate the trencher itself. Every last crumb. Because wasting food was not just rude, it was survival. But here's where the system gets interesting. What happened to all those used noble trenchers? They went to the poor. Castles and manor houses kept a distribution system. After feasts, servants collected the used trenchers and took them to the gates where beggars and village poor waited. These bread plates, now heavy with grease and food remnants, were distributed as alms. It was charity, but it was also theatre, a visible demonstration of noble generosity. Look how much we have that we can give away our dishes. Some historians argue this was genuine compassion. Others see it as a way to manage the poor, keeping them dependent and grateful. Both things can be true. A starving person doesn't care about the politics of the trencher they're eating. They just taste the gravy. You're back at that table watching a servant remove your trencher. It's soaked through now, dark with meat juice and wine. You've been eating roasted pork and the bread has absorbed every drop of fat. Somewhere outside, someone will eat this tonight. They'll taste what you tasted hours later, second hand. The quality of your trencher also signalled your status. Fine white bread trenchers manchet were for the high table only. Lords' ladies honoured guests. The bread was expensive, made from sifted wheat flour, and even when soaked it retained some structural integrity. Eating off manchet meant you mattered. Lower tables got maslin trenchers mixed. Grain bread, coarser, greyer. It did the job but fell apart faster. And the lowest tables got straight rye or barley bread, which turned to mush almost immediately, and tasted like desperation even before it was used as a plate. Children were taught trencher etiquette early. Don't pick at your plate. Don't eat it during the meal unless you're genuinely starving and no one important is watching. Don't let it break. Your trencher was a test of self-control, a visible measure of whether you understood delayed gratification. Some nobles took the system further. They had special trenchers carved from very stale bread, almost like edible wood. These lasted multiple courses and could be reused across several meals before they finally softened enough for distribution. It was efficiency, but it also felt a bit like hoarding. How many times can you reuse a bread plate before it stops being generosity and starts being stinginess? Recipe books rarely mention trenchers because they were so common, so obvious that writing them down seemed pointless. But a few accounts survive. One 14th century text suggests brushing trenchers with egg white before baking to create a moisture barrier. Another recommends cutting them in diamond shapes for aesthetic purposes because even your edible plate should look impressive. By the 15th century, wooden and metal plates were becoming more common, at least among the wealthy. Trenchers started to disappear from high tables. But in village inns, taverns and poorer households they persisted for centuries. Bread plates were practical. They reduced dishwashing, a significant concern when water had to be hauled from wells and heated over fires. You finish your meal. Your trencher sits there, a compressed record of everything you ate. A servant lifts it away carefully, adding it to the collection. Tonight it'll feed someone whose name you'll never know, whose hunger you'll never feel, whose gratitude you'll never hear. And tomorrow you'll eat off a fresh piece of bread and do it all again, this small ritual of consumption and distribution, this daily reminder that in the Middle Ages even your plate had a social life after you were done with it. You've eaten off bread that fed someone else later. Now let's talk about eating something the Romans loved so much they bred them in special jars, and medieval nobles decided to revive. Dormice, not field mice, not regular mice. Dormice, plump squirrel-like rodents with bushy tails and enormous eyes, animals that hibernate through winter and wake up fat with stored energy. animals that when roasted with honey and spices supposedly tasted like the finest pork. You're in a medieval kitchen garden, and the cook is showing you something unusual. A clay pot partially buried in the ground, filled with acorns, chestnuts, and walnuts. Inside, barely visible, are 3 dormice. They're not pets, they're livestock. Welcome to the strange intersection of Roman nostalgia and medieval luxury, where eating tiny mammals became a status symbol because ancient texts said it was sophisticated. The practice started centuries earlier. Romans kept dormice in specialized terracotta jars called gliraria vessels with air holes and interior ramps where the animals could climb and feed. They'd fatten the dormice on nuts for weeks, sometimes months, until they were almost spherical. Then they'd kill them, stuff them with pork and pine nuts, roll them in honey and poppy seeds, and roast them whole. Medieval Europeans obsessed with recreating Roman glory read these accounts and thought we should definitely bring this back. So they did. Dormouse farming became a niche but documented practice among nobles who wanted to impress guests with classical knowledge. You couldn't just serve dormice, you had to mention that you were serving them. You had to reference Apicius the Roman cookbook. You had to make it clear this wasn't desperation, this was erudition. Historians still argue how widespread dormouse consumption actually was. Some say it remained rare, limited to a few experimental kitchens. Others point to account books from large estates that list payments for glyers and the ceramic jars to keep them in. The evidence suggests it happened, but not commonly, which made it even more impressive when it did. You're watching the cook prepare tonight's batch. He's removed the dormice from their fattening jar. They're drowsy, slow-moving from their enriched diet. He kills them quickly, a sharp blow to the head, then begins the process of cleaning and stuffing. Each dormouse is barely bigger than your thumb. The cook works with tweezers and small knives, removing organs, inserting a paste made from ground pork, crushed hazelnuts, and dried fruit. It's intricate work. One wrong cut and the whole thing falls apart. Once stuffed, the dormice are brushed with honey mixed with wine. Then they're rolled in crushed poppy seeds until they look like tiny furry pastries. Finally, they go onto a small roasting rack over gentle coals. The cook watches them carefully. Too much heat and they'll char. Too little and they won't render their fat. The smell is strange, sweet. From the honey nutty, from the stuffing, and underneath it all, something gamey and wild. It's not unpleasant, but it's not familiar either. It smells like ambition and ancient history. You're at the feast now. The dormice arrive on a silver platter arranged in a circle like petals. Each one is glazed and glistening. The Lord explains their provenance, mentions the Romans, drops the word Apicius casually. His guests nod appreciatively, even though most of them have no idea what he's talking about. You take one. It's small enough to eat in 2 bites. The skin is crispy, the honey caramelized. The meat inside is rich, slightly sweet from the nut stuffing. It does taste like miniature pork concentrated. You can see why Romans loved this. You can also see why it never became a staple. The effort to reward ratio is absurd. Each dormouse represents hours of care, catching them in the first place, keeping them alive and fed, fattening them properly, then the delicate butchery and cooking. For maybe 2 bites of meat, it's not food, it's performance art that happens to be edible. Some medieval recipes suggest serving dormice with a sauce of wine pepper and fish sauce, another Roman throwback. Others recommend dusting them with cinnamon and presenting them on a bed of bay leaves. The details varied, but the core idea remained. These were not normal food. These were conversation pieces that you chewed. Children were sometimes served dormice at their first formal feast as a test of sophistication. Could you eat a tiny roasted mammal without flinching? Could you appreciate the reference to classical texts you'd been forced to study? Could you perform nobility convincingly? In some regions, dormice were replaced with other small animals, baby rabbits, young squirrels, but prepared in the same style, stuffed and honeyed and roasted. The Romans didn't eat those, but the aesthetic was close enough. What mattered wasn't authenticity. What mattered was the gesture toward a grander, more refined past. You finish your dormouse. It sits tiny in your stomach, barely noticeable among all the other courses, but you'll remember it. Not because it was delicious, though it was fine, but because you ate something that required a footnote, something that needed explanation, something that proved you belonged at this table with these people who consumed history along with their dinner. You've eaten dormice that tasted like tiny pork. Now let's talk about something even smaller, spikier, and somehow blessed by saints. Hedgehogs. You're walking through autumn woods with a hunter. He's not looking for deer or boar, he's looking for hedgehogs, and he's found 3 already curled into defensive balls among the fallen leaves. He picks them up carefully, spines don't bother him anymore, and drops them into a sack. Tonight, these will be dinner. Welcome to medieval hedgehog cuisine, where a garden pest became a delicacy through sheer culinary determination and a coating of clay. Hedgehogs were everywhere in medieval Europe. They raided gardens, nested under woodpiles, and were generally considered harmless nuisances. But they were also made of meat, and in a world where protein was precious, that meant they were food. The question was, how do you cook something covered in spines? The answer, you don't remove the spines, you work around them. The most common method was clay baking. You'd kill the hedgehog, usually a quick blow, then coat the entire animal in thick wet clay spines and all. No gutting, no cleaning. Just wrap it in mud like a medieval burrito and toss it into the coals of your fire. The clay would harden in the heat, essentially creating a temporary oven around the hedgehog. After an hour or so, you'd pull the clay ball from the fire, let it cool slightly, then crack it open like an egg. The spines would come away with the clay stuck in the dried mud, leaving behind a cooked hedgehog that was theoretically ready to eat. You're back in the kitchen watching this process. The clay ball sits in the coals, glowing faintly. The cook explains that you have to use the right kind of clay. River clay works best because it doesn't crack too early. He also mentions that the hedgehog's own fat bastes the meat as it cooks, making it tender and rich. When he finally cracks the clay, the smell hits you earthy, fatty, slightly sweet. The hedgehog inside is steaming, its skin darkened but intact. He peels away the outer layer carefully, then portions the meat. It's dark, almost like wild duck, with a flavour that's been described in medieval texts as between pork and hare. Some people loved it, others found it too gamey, too wild. But everyone agreed it was better than starving, and in bad years hedgehog populations kept villages fed. Here's where it gets strange. Hedgehogs had a reputation for holiness. Several medieval saints were associated with them. Saint Martin supposedly blessed hedgehogs, making them safe to eat. Another legend claimed that hedgehogs were immune to snake venom and could cure people bitten by vipers if you ate the meat. None of this was true, but belief mattered more than biology. Some regions developed rituals around hedgehog consumption. You'd say a prayer before cooking. You'd save the clay shell afterward and crumble it into your garden as protection against pests. The hedgehog became more than food. It became a minor participant in folk religion. Historians still argue whether hedgehog was peasant food or something nobles ate for novelty. The truth seems to be both. Poor families ate hedgehog regularly during autumn when the animals were fattest. Noble households occasionally served it as an exotic dish, often prepared differently, skinned and roasted on a spit with wine and herbs, bypassing the clay method entirely. Recipe books mention hedgehogs sparingly, almost apologetically. One 14th century text suggests boiling the meat after clay roasting, then serving it cold in jelly. Another recommends chopping it fine and mixing it into a pie with apples and raisins, essentially hiding what you're eating. You taste a piece. It's tender, surprisingly mild, with a texture closer to rabbit than pork. The fat has kept it moist. You understand why people ate this, why they developed techniques to make it work. Hedgehogs weren't elegant, but they were efficient small packages of calories that required minimal preparation. In some villages, hedgehog hunting was a children's task. Kids would search hedgerows and ditches, collecting the animals in baskets. It taught them about providing food, about resourcefulness. A child who brought home 3 hedgehogs was contributing meaningfully to the household. But there was also shame attached. Eating hedgehog marked you as rural, unsophisticated. Urban dwellers mocked it. Court poets wrote satirical verses about country folk gnawing on prickle pigs. The hedgehog became a class marker, a food that revealed your status by its presence on your table. By the late Middle Ages, as food systems stabilized and meat became more available, hedgehog consumption declined among those who could afford alternatives. It retreated back into poverty, into desperation, into the category of things we ate when we had to. But in the early medieval period, during famines, during cold winters, when hunted game was scarce, the hedgehog was salvation. Small, abundant, cookable with nothing but clay and fire. You didn't need knives or skill. You just needed hunger and a willingness to crack open mud to find dinner. The hunter finishes his meal and tosses the clay shards into the garden. Tomorrow he'll check his traps for rabbits. But tonight, blessed by questionable saints and cooked in river clay, the hedgehog kept him fed. You've eaten hedgehogs blessed by dubious saints. Now let's talk about something so massive that when one washed ashore, an entire village stopped working for a week. Whales. You're standing on a cold beach staring at something that shouldn't exist on land. A whale 60 feet long, 20 tons of blubber and meat has beached itself during the night. The tide is going out. The creature is dying, possibly already dead, and you, along with everyone else in the village, are about to become very, very busy. Welcome to medieval whale culture, where marine mammals were emergency food supplies, legal nightmares, and occasional gifts from God that smelled like rotting fish. First, the legal situation in England: all beached whales belonged to the crown. They were royal fish, which meant that technically you couldn't just carve one up and take it home. You had to report it, wait for royal officials to arrive, and hope they'd grant you permission to harvest it. In practice, by the time officials showed up, often days later, the whale was already half butchered and distributed. The crown would claim a symbolic portion, usually the head or tail, and everyone pretended this was the original plan. But let's say you're in a region where the rules are more relaxed or where no one's watching. You and 50 neighbours approach the whale with axes, saws and knives. The work is brutal. Whale hide is thick, sometimes 6 inches of tough skin and blubber. Cutting through it is like trying to saw through a waterlogged mattress made of rubber. You start with the blubber. This is the treasure. Whale fat renders into oil that burns clean and bright, much better than tallow candles. You cut it in strips, peeling it away from the muscle beneath. The strips are as long as your arm, white and glistening. They'll be boiled down later in massive cauldrons, producing gallons of oil that will light your lamps for months. The smell is indescribable. Marine decay mixed with raw fat plus whatever the whale ate before dying. It clings to your clothes, your hair, your skin. You'll smell like whale for weeks. Your neighbours will smell like whale. The entire village will smell like whale. But no one complains, because this is abundance. Next comes the meat. Whale meat is dark red, almost purple, dense and muscular. It doesn't look like fish, it looks like beef that went to sea. You hack off chunks working fast because the meat spoils quickly. What you can't preserve immediately will be salted or smoked. Some will be eaten fresh, boiled in seawater right there on the beach, distributed to everyone who helped with the butchering. You taste a piece boiled and unseasoned. It's strong, fishy, chewy. It tastes like the ocean concentrated into muscle. It's not delicious, but it's protein, and that makes it valuable beyond measure. Historians still argue about how whale meat was actually perceived. Some texts suggest it was delicacy reserved for special occasions. Others describe it as famine food, eaten only when nothing else was available. The truth probably depends on freshness. A newly beached whale butchered immediately might be tolerable. A whale that's been rotting for 3 days is survival eating. Churches loved whale meat because it counted as fish. During Lent, a beached whale was a miracle, tons of fish, appearing exactly when meat was forbidden. Coastal monasteries kept detailed records of whale strandings, treating them as divine providence. Some abbots claimed that whales beached themselves specifically to feed the faithful during holy fasts, which is a lovely thought, until you remember that whales beach because they're sick, injured, or disoriented. But the church's enthusiasm meant that whale became associated with piety. Eating it during Lent wasn't just allowed, it was virtuous. You were consuming a gift from God delivered via confused cetacean navigation. The blubber had other uses beyond lamp oil. It was waterproofing for leather lubrication for wagon wheels, even a base for primitive soap. Nothing was wasted. The bones were carved into tools, fence posts, even structural supports for buildings. In some coastal areas you can still find medieval structures with whale ribs embedded in their foundations. You work through the day and into the evening. Torches are lit. The butchering continues. Children run back and forth carrying buckets of blubber. Dogs fight over scraps. Seabirds circle overhead screaming. This is communal labour on a scale the village rarely experiences, everyone united by sudden, massive, smelly fortune. By the 3rd day the whale is mostly bones and stench. What meat remains is too far gone even for salt. You leave it for the birds and tide. The beach will smell for months, but your cellars are full of salted whale, your lamps burn with whale oil, and your priest has declared the whole event a blessing. Medieval writers sometimes described whales as islands, creatures so large that sailors would mistake them for land, moor their ships and light cooking fires on their backs, only to have the island dive and drown them. These stories weren't true, but they captured something real. Whales existed at a scale that defied normal understanding. They were too big, too strange, too otherworldly to be just animals, and when one died on your beach, it stopped being a creature and became a resource, a problem, a community event, and a really persistent smell all at once. You've butchered a whale on a beach. Now let's talk about how medieval Christians turned culinary deception into devotion. You're in a monastery kitchen during Lent. Meat is forbidden. But the abbot is wealthy, the monks are restless, and everyone's tired of plain boiled fish. So the cook is about to perform alchemy, not the kind that turns lead into gold, but the kind that turns almonds into cheese eggs and bacon. Welcome to the world of fake food, where medieval chefs became expert illusionists creating elaborate meat substitutes, not from necessity but from competitive piety. It started with almond milk. Almonds crushed and soaked in water produce a creamy white liquid that looks remarkably like dairy. And since almonds grew on trees, they counted as plant-based, which meant they were Lent legal. Medieval cooks realized this liquid could replace cow's milk in almost any recipe, and suddenly Lent got a lot more interesting. You're watching the cook work. He's made gallons of almond milk the result of hours of grinding almonds in a mortar, soaking them, straining the liquid through cloth. Now he's thickening it with rice flour and saffron, shaping it into blocks and letting it set. In a few hours he'll have cheese that looks and feels like the real thing but contains no dairy. The texture is wrong if you know what you're looking for. It's slightly grainy, doesn't melt the same way, but serve it confidently, don't mention what it's made from, and most people will eat it without question. Next he makes eggs. Not real eggs, those came from chickens, which were meat adjacent and therefore suspicious during Lent. Instead, he mixes almond milk with saffron for colour, thickens it with fish glue, and pours it into blown eggshells. Once set, he cracks them open at the table. They look exactly like boiled eggs. They even peel like boiled eggs, but they're plants and fish products arranged to trick your memory. Historians still argue whether this was culinary creativity or theological loophole hunting taken too far. The Church said no meat during Lent. It never said your food couldn't look, smell, and almost taste like meat. So monks and nobles engaged in what one writer called pious forgery foods that honoured the letter of the law while completely ignoring its spirit. The most ambitious fake food was mock bacon. Cooks would take strips of root vegetables, parsnips, turnips, and smoke them over wood fires. Then they'd glaze them with saffron-tinted fat rendered from fish or seal blubber. The result looked like bacon, had a smoky flavour like bacon, and could be fried until crisp like bacon. It wasn't bacon. But in candlelight after 3 weeks of Lent, your brain would accept it as bacon. You're at the refectory table now. The fake feast arrives, almond cheese tarts, mock egg pudding, a platter of what appears to be roasted chicken, but is actually fish paste moulded around wooden frames, glazed with saffron and decorated with pastry, feathers. You cut into the chicken. It falls apart wrong. The texture is mushy, the flavour aggressively fishy despite the spices. But the effort is impressive. Someone spent hours constructing this lie, and you're honour-bound to appreciate it. Some monasteries competed over who could create the most convincing fake foods. Recipe books from wealthy houses include instructions for marzipan shaped like lamb chops, for fish mousse, sculpted to look like whole birds, for jellied almond cream moulded into the shape of suckling pigs. These weren't meals. These were culinary still-life paintings you could technically eat. The irony was obvious even then. The whole point of Lent was sacrifice simplicity, denial of pleasure. But wealthy Christians were spending fortunes on almonds, saffron and sugar to create elaborate imitations of the very things they were supposed to be abstaining from. They were fasting luxuriously. Critics within the church noticed. Some preachers condemned fake food as vanity, as missing the point of self-denial. If you're eating something designed to trick you into thinking you're eating meat, they argued you're still indulging the sin of gluttony, just with extra steps and worse ingredients. But the practice continued because people liked it. The challenge of creating convincing fakes became a culinary art form. Cooks developed techniques that wouldn't be matched until modern molecular gastronomy. They understood emulsification, gelation flavour layering. They were doing science, even if they thought they were just being clever. You finish your fake eggs. They taste like expensive disappointment, interesting, texturally bizarre flavour-wise, but undeniably innovative. The cook appears anxious for feedback. You nod appreciatively. He beams. He's already planning next year's Lenten menu: mock ham almond butter shaped like wheels of dairy fish paste sausages that he swears will be indistinguishable from the real thing. They won't be. They never are. But the performance matters more than the accuracy. The message is clear: we're so devoted to the rules that we'll spend obscene amounts of money and effort to almost break them without technically breaking them. Outside, peasants are eating plain boiled vegetables and considering it adequate. Inside monasteries and manor houses, the wealthy are eating what amounts to medieval sci-fi food, engineered substitutes that exist solely because someone said, "You can't have that," and the rich replied, "Watch us get as close as possible." The fake feast ends. Your stomach is full but confused. You've eaten things that look like memories but tasted like chemistry experiments. And tomorrow it'll happen again because there are still 30 days of Lent left, and someone's already perfecting a recipe for mock duck. You've eaten fake eggs made from almonds. Now let's talk about a drink that was medicine's social lubricant, and occasionally poison all in the same ornate cup, hippocras. You're at an evening gathering in a manor house. The meal is finished, but the night isn't over. A servant appears carrying a silver pitcher and delicate cups. He pours carefully. The liquid is deep red, almost purple, and it smells like Christmas. Exploded cinnamon, ginger cloves, something floral you can't quite place. This is hippocras, and drinking it means you're either very wealthy or very sick. Sometimes both. Welcome to medieval spiced wine culture, where a single cup could cost a labourer's weekly wage and was believed to cure everything from indigestion to infertility. Hippocras wasn't just wine with spices thrown in. It was a precise medical formulation based on ancient Greek theories about bodily humours. The recipe varied, but the core was always the same good wine, usually red, sometimes white, infused with cinnamon, ginger grains of paradise, long pepper and sugar. Lots of sugar. The mixture would steep for hours, sometimes days, then be strained through a special conical cloth bag called a hippocras sleeve until it ran perfectly clear. The result was potent, expensive, and supposedly therapeutic. Medieval doctors prescribed it for dozens of conditions: cold stomach hippocras, melancholy hippocras, wedding night nerves. Definitely hippocras because it was believed to heat the blood and encourage, let's call it marital enthusiasm. You take a sip. The sweetness hits first, then the spice a warmth that spreads from your tongue down your throat into your chest. It's strong, complex, nothing like plain wine. Each spice is identifiable, but also part of something larger. This is what wealth tastes like, you think. This is what power drinks. The name came from Hippocrates, the ancient Greek physician, though he never made this specific drink. Medieval Europeans loved attributing things to classical authorities. It made innovations seem traditional, medicinal drinks seem scientific. If you called something after Hippocrates, people trusted it, even if the recipe was invented by a bored monk in the 1300s. Different regions developed different versions. English hippocras tended toward heavy ginger and galangal. French versions used more cinnamon and included rosewater. Italian recipes sometimes added musk or ambergris, whale secretions for extra exotic prestige. Historians still argue whether these regional differences reflected genuine taste preferences or just local spice availability. Making hippocras was a status activity. The spices alone cost a fortune. Cinnamon came from Ceylon, ginger from India, grains of paradise from West Africa. These weren't ingredients you stumbled upon at a village market. These were imports that travelled thousands of miles, changed hands dozens of times, and arrived smelling like adventure and profit margins. Sugar was equally precious. Medieval Europe produced almost no sugar. It came from the Middle East, or later from Mediterranean islands. It was sold by the ounce, stored carefully, sometimes locked away. Using pounds of it to make a drink was a flex, a way of announcing that you had money to literally dissolve. You're watching the preparation now. The cook pours wine into a large bowl, then adds the spices, whole sticks of cinnamon, fresh ginger root, sliced thin cardamom pods crushed open. He adds sugar, more than seems reasonable, stirring until it dissolves. The mixture will sit overnight, the wine drawing out flavour and oils from the spices. Tomorrow he'll strain it. This process is crucial. The hippocras sleeve a long narrow cloth bag suspended over a bowl filters the liquid, slowly catching every particle of spice and sediment. The resulting wine should be crystal clear, almost glowing. Cloudy hippocras was failure. It meant you'd used inferior cloth or didn't understand the chemistry. Medieval medical texts are obsessed with hippocras's properties. It opens the liver, strengthens the heart, aids digestion, purifies the blood. One doctor claimed it could restore youth. Another said it cured plague. It did not. But belief was powerful, and if you drank expensive spiced wine, believing it would help, maybe the placebo effect plus the alcohol actually did something. There was also a social dimension. Offering hippocras to guests meant respect. It was served after meals before bed during negotiations. Refusing it could be insulting. Drinking it created bonds. You were sharing something precious, trusting your host not to poison you, because yes, hippocras's complex flavour was perfect for masking poison. Several medieval murder plots involved poisoned hippocras, the spices hiding the taste of arsenic or hemlock. You finish your cup. The warmth has spread through your whole body now. You feel looser, braver, slightly invincible. This is why medieval people loved it, not just the taste, but the feeling. Hippocras was liquid confidence, bottled optimism, fermented possibility. Peasants made their own versions, of course. They couldn't afford cinnamon or sugar, so they used local herbs, mugwort, tansy, wormwood mixed with cheap ale or wine. It was called caudle or caudle, and it served the same social function, a special drink for special occasions. Weddings, births, funerals. Times when ordinary life needed elevation, even if you could only afford bitter herbs and hope. But real hippocras remained elite. It appeared in account books as a significant expense. Royal weddings served it by the barrel. Diplomatic gifts included recipes and pre-mixed spice blends. To know how to make proper hippocras was a mark of sophistication. By the late Middle Ages, hippocras had competition. Distilled spirits were arriving, offering faster intoxication with less sugar. But hippocras persisted because it was ritual, not just recreation. It was the drink you served when you wanted to impress, heal, seduce, or negotiate. It was wine that meant something beyond itself. The servant refills your cup. You didn't ask for more, but refusing would be awkward. So you drink and the spices bloom again, and somewhere in your warming blood you understand why medieval people believed this could cure anything. Not because it actually could, but because feeling this good had to be medicinal. You've drunk wine that cost more than a horse. Now let's talk about the meal that fed more people than any other dish in medieval history, the one that simmered in every cottage and castle, the eternal pot that defined survival. Pottage. You're standing in a peasant cottage at dawn. In the centre of the room, hanging over a fire that never fully goes out, is a cauldron. It's been there for years, decades maybe. The iron is black from smoke, the outside crusted with soot. Inside something bubbles, always. This is pottage, and it's not quite soup, not quite stew. It's thicker than one, thinner than the other, and it changes every day based on what gets thrown in. Yesterday it was mostly turnips and barley. Today someone added dried peas and the bones from Sunday's chicken. Tomorrow it might be onions, cabbage and hope. Welcome to the backbone of medieval cuisine, the dish that kept millions alive, that required no recipe, because everyone knew how to make it. That revealed your social class by its colour and texture. For peasants, pottage was breakfast, lunch and dinner. You woke up, stirred the pot, ladled some into a bowl, ate it with bread. You worked all day. You came home, stirred the pot, added whatever you'd gathered, herbs from the roadside, vegetables from the garden, water to keep it from burning, and ate again. The pot never emptied completely. You just kept adding, kept cooking, kept eating. The consistency varied wildly. In good times, pottage was thick with peas and beans, rich with the fat from a bacon rind someone tossed in weeks ago. In bad times, it was mostly water and old cabbage thin enough to see the bottom of your bowl. The colour told the story. Green meant herbs and fresh vegetables. Brown meant grains and roots. Grey meant desperation. You taste a spoonful. It's earthy, slightly sour from fermentation, bland but filling. There's no identifiable flavour profile. It's just pottage, that universal taste of survival that your ancestors ate and your children will eat, and everyone you know has eaten their entire lives. Medieval cookbooks barely mention pottage because it was too common to document. It's like writing down instructions for breathing. Everyone knew. The pot hangs over the fire. You add food. You cook it. You eat it. What's to explain? But a few recipes survive, usually from noble households trying to elevate the concept. Pottage for nobles might include almond milk, saffron dates, and carefully chopped capon meat. It would be strained, smooth-seasoned, precisely served in individual bowls with garnishes. It was still pottage-cooked vegetables and protein in liquid, but with enough expensive ingredients to pretend it was something else. The peasant version had its own sophistication, though. Experienced cooks knew which herbs made pottage. Heat your body, garlic, onions, pepper if you could get it. They knew which vegetables stayed firm and which dissolved into thickener. They understood timing peas needed hours, greens needed minutes. This was practical chemistry learned through generations of hunger. Pottage also had social rules. The best portion, the thickest with the most vegetables, went to the head of household. Children got thinner portions. Elderly family members got special batches, sometimes with extra fat or honey to help them maintain weight. The pot was communal, but the distribution was hierarchical. In monasteries, pottage was formalized. There were rules about Lenten pottage versus ordinary pottage versus feast day pottage. Monks ate it from communal bowls in silence, each spoonful, theoretically bringing them closer to spiritual purity through humble nourishment. Some monasteries developed signature pottages. One might be famous for its pea pottage, another for a version heavy with fish during Lent. You're back at that peasant cottage watching the pot. The fire beneath it is fed constantly but never roaring, just enough to keep the pottage at a gentle simmer. This is important. If the fire goes out and the pottage cools completely, it can spoil. If the fire gets too hot, the pottage burns to the bottom of the pot, and cleaning that is a nightmare that can take days. So the pot stays warm always, the liquid moving slightly, the smell filling the cottage, onions, smoke old vegetables, life itself in vaporized form. Historians still argue whether continuous pottage was sanitary. The modern mind recoils food sitting in a pot for weeks, bacteria contamination. But the constant heat killed most pathogens. The acidity from fermentation created a hostile environment for dangerous bacteria, and people had iron stomachs, literally and figuratively. They ate things that would hospitalize modern humans, and they survived because their bodies had adapted. Pottage also became metaphorical. Earning your pottage meant doing enough work to deserve food. Thin pottage was an insult. It meant you were poor, struggling, failing. Thick pottage was aspiration. Even in language, the dish marked your worth. Children grew up watching the pot, learning to stir it, eventually taking over the responsibility. It was a rite of passage the day you became old enough to manage the fire and the pottage without supervision. You'd proved you could keep the family fed literally and symbolically. The pot itself became almost sacred. Some families named their cauldrons, passed them down through generations. A good iron pot was valuable. It represented continuity, survival, the promise that tomorrow there would still be something to eat. You take another spoonful. It's not delicious. It's not supposed to be. It's fuel. It's insurance against starvation. It's the taste of endurance, bland, filling eternal. Every peasant in Europe is eating some version of this right now. Kings might feast on peacocks, but everyone else eats pottage. And tonight before bed, someone will toss in tomorrow's ingredients, whatever was gathered, whatever was left. The pot will simmer through the night, and in the morning it'll still be there, still bubbling, still feeding, still surviving. You've eaten pottage that's been simmering since your grandmother was young. Now let's talk about the meals that made you realise when you're hungry enough. Anything with a pulse is food. You're in a medieval forest during a bad harvest year. The grain stores are low. The pigs were slaughtered early because there wasn't enough to feed them through winter. Your stomach has been growling for weeks. And overhead you hear squirrels chattering in the oak trees. Welcome to the world of necessity meat. The animals that medieval Europeans ate not because they were delicious, but because they were there, catchable, and technically edible. Squirrels were everywhere. Grey squirrels, red squirrels, fat from acorns in autumn. Poor families hunted them with slings, traps, trained dogs. You'd skin them quickly, the pelt could be sold or used, then roast the meat over an open fire. Squirrel tasted gamey, slightly nutty tough if you didn't cook it long enough. But it was protein, and protein meant survival. Children learned to hunt squirrels as practice for larger game. A boy who could reliably bring home 3 squirrels a week was contributing real value to his household. The meat went into pottage, was roasted on sticks, sometimes dried and saved for deeper winter. But squirrels were almost respectable compared to what came next. Crows. You're watching your neighbour set traps in his barley field. Crows have been eating the seeds, which means they're fat, which means they're food. By evening he's caught 4. He'll roast them tonight, probably with onions to mask the flavour, because crow tastes like the worst parts of dark meat chicken, mixed with something that died angry. Medieval recipe books rarely mention crow, which tells you everything. It wasn't cuisine, it was crisis management. But people ate it especially in early spring when winter stores were depleted and new crops hadn't come in yet. That hungry gap between seasons when anything that moved became potential dinner. Swans appeared on noble tables, but herons were strange middle ground birds. Too large to ignore, too fishy to enjoy. They nested in colonies which made them easy to locate. Noble households kept heron hawking rights. You needed permission to hunt them, but enforcement was spotty. If you were hungry enough and found a heron nest, you took the eggs, maybe the chicks. Adult heron meat was tough, required hours of stewing, tasted like swamp. But it was big. 1 heron could feed a family for 2 days. You're in a village now where someone has just caught a swan without permission. This is serious. Swans belong to the crown or local lords. But the swan is already dead, already plucked, and already in pieces. The village makes a collective decision: eat it quickly. Burn the feathers, never speak of this again. The meat is darker than expected, oily, with a flavour somewhere between duck and regret. Everyone eats, everyone stays quiet. Historians still argue how common poaching was. The laws were harsh, poaching deer could get you hanged, but enforcement required catching people in the act, and hungry villagers were creative. They knew the forests better than any game warden. They knew which animals were watched and which were effectively free. Rabbits were legitimate game in many areas, which made them popular. But when rabbit populations crashed, disease overhunting, bad breeding years, people moved to less desirable options. Rats. Let's be clear, people didn't eat rats regularly. But during sieges, famines and plagues, when normal food chains collapsed, rats were there. They were everywhere, and they were made of meat. Accounts from besieged castles mention eating rats after the grain ran out, after the horses were gone, after everything else was consumed. The rats tasted terrible, gamey, slightly sweet, stringy, but starvation makes you flexible about flavour. Some texts suggest rats were skinned and prepared like small rabbits, gutted, spitted, roasted quickly. Others mention boiling them in heavily spiced water to mask the taste. No one wrote these instructions down in cookbooks, because admitting you knew how to cook rats meant admitting you'd been that hungry. You're back in better times now, watching someone roast a pigeon. Pigeons were acceptable, they nested in dovecotes, were semi-domesticated, tasted decent. But the line between acceptable bird and desperate choice was thin. Magpies, jays, even woodpeckers appeared in cooking pots during hard times. The strangest might be dormice again, remember those Roman delicacies from earlier? When nobles weren't eating them for classical sophistication, peasants were trapping them for basic calories. Same animal, completely different context. One was exotic cuisine, the other was, "We found these in the barn." Dogs and cats were mostly off-limits, protected by sentiment and utility dogs. Guarded cats hunted mice. But during true famines, even those boundaries weakened. Chronicles from the worst plague years and sieges mention people eating everything. Everything. The social contract around food dissolved when starvation was guaranteed and yesterday's pet became tomorrow's survival. Medieval people developed a hierarchy of shame around these meals. Squirrel fine, normal, no judgment. Crow people understood. Swan stolen from royal property. Dangerous but comprehensible. Rat. You didn't talk about it afterward. You just survived and tried to forget. What's striking is how practical people were. Modern sensibilities recoil from eating crow or rat, but medieval Europeans couldn't afford squeamishness. Food was food, protein was protein. The animal's appearance or reputation mattered less than whether it would keep you alive until spring. You finish your meal, let's say it was squirrel nicely roasted, not terrible. Outside the forest is full of creatures that might become dinner if times get worse. Crows in the trees, herons by the stream, rats in the walls. Your stomach is full for now, but you've learned to look at the world differently. Not as nature, but as an emergency pantry. Not as wildlife, but as food that hasn't been caught yet. You've eaten squirrels and contemplated rats. Now let's talk about food that required darkness, patience, and occasionally prayers to saints who may or may not have been listening. Cheese. Not just any cheese. Medieval cheese aged in caves tended by monks guarded like treasure, and sometimes believed to be alive. You're descending stone steps into a monastery cellar. The temperature drops with each step. The air smells damp, earthy, and underneath that something sharp, almost aggressive. At the bottom, in the flickering light of your candle, you see them hundreds of cheese wheels stacked on wooden shelves, some as large as wagon wheels, their rinds covered in patches of white, blue and grey mould. Welcome to medieval cheese caves where monks created foods that could outlive them, and where fermentation was half science, half prayer. Cheese in the Middle Ages wasn't the standardized product you'd recognize today. Every region, every monastery, every farm had its own version, based on local milk, local techniques and local bacteria that no one understood but everyone respected. The monks were especially serious about it. Cheese was Lent legal protein. It lasted through winter, and making it was meditative work that filled the hours between prayers. The process started simply enough: milk curdled with rennet, usually extracted from a calf's stomach lining, then pressed into moulds to remove moisture. But after that things got interesting. The cheese wheels were taken down into caves or cellars, where the temperature stayed constant and the humidity was high, and then they were left. For months, sometimes years. You're watching a monk inspect his cheeses now. He walks slowly down the rows, touching each wheel, sniffing, sometimes scraping mould off with a knife. He knows every cheese here, when it was made, which cow's milk went into it, how it's developing. This isn't just food storage. This is relationship. The mould was crucial but mysterious. Medieval cheesemakers knew that certain moulds meant good flavour, others meant the cheese was ruined. They couldn't explain why germ theory wouldn't exist for centuries, but they recognised patterns. White fuzzy mould on the rind good, green spreading from a crack bad, blue veins inside. Depends on the cheese, but probably fine. Some monasteries developed signature cheeses that became famous across regions. Monks would trade recipes, starter cultures, techniques. A visiting monk might bring a piece of his monastery's cheese as a gift, and the receiving monastery would study it, trying to replicate whatever made it special. Historians still argue whether this was genuine knowledge sharing or medieval industrial espionage. The caves themselves were considered almost magical. The right cave could make cheese mature perfectly. The wrong cave would ruin an entire season's production. Monks believed certain caves were blessed, that saints watched over the cheese, guided the fermentation, protected it from evil spirits that caused spoilage. Some wheels were literally blessed. A priest would say prayers over new cheeses before they went into the cave, marking them with crosses, sprinkling them with holy water. Whether this helped the cheese or just made the monks feel better is debatable, but it was standard practice at many monasteries. You taste a piece the monk cuts for you. It's sharp, crumbly, intensely flavoured. Nothing like the mild cheese you might know. This tastes like the cave mineral, ancient, almost aggressive in its complexity. Your mouth puckers slightly. The monk smiles. This is proper cheese, he seems to say. Cheese with character. Not all cheese was aged dramatically. Peasants made fresh cheese soft, mild, spoiling within days because they didn't have caves and couldn't wait months for food. But aged cheese was valuable. It could be transported, traded, sold. A wheel of good monastery cheese could buy tools, cloth, other necessities. The size of cheese wheels wasn't arbitrary. Larger wheels aged more slowly, developed deeper flavours, and were more stable during transport. A 50-pound wheel of cheese could travel for weeks without spoiling, while fresh cheese would be rancid in 3 days. So monasteries made massive wheels, some requiring 2 monks to lift. Cheese also became currency in some regions. Rents were paid in cheese wheels. Tithes included cheese. Marriages were negotiated with cheese as part of the dowry. A family with good cheese-making skills and a productive cow was genuinely wealthy. The strangest cheeses were the ones buried in hay, wrapped in leaves, or soaked in wine. Each technique created different flavours, textures, mould, patterns. Some cheeses were made specifically to be nearly inedible when young but incredible after a year underground, wrapped in grape leaves, developing flavours that no one could predict but everyone hoped for. You're back in the cave watching the monk tend his charges. He explains that cheese is alive, not metaphorically actually alive, with the processes that transform milk into something that lasts. He doesn't know about bacteria and enzymes, but he understands that cheese requires care, attention, the right conditions. He treats it like a garden that grows in darkness. Some wheels fail. The mould goes wrong, the cheese cracks and dries out, or it develops off flavours that make it unsellable. These failures are fed to pigs or in desperate times eaten anyway. But the successful wheels, the ones that age perfectly, that develop complex flavours that make visiting nobles nod appreciatively, those are triumphs. Those are proof that the monks understand something profound about transformation, patience, and faith. The monk selects an older wheel, one that's been aging for nearly 2 years. He cuts into it ceremonially. The interior is dense, almost crystalline in texture. The flavour is overwhelming, salty sharp with notes you can't identify, but that make you understand why people valued this. This cheese he tells you was made the winter his brother died. He remembers the day, the cold, the sadness, and now 2 years later that milk has become this something that can feed dozens of people, that carries memory forward, that transforms grief into nourishment through time and darkness and mould that may or may not be blessed. You leave the cave with a small piece wrapped in cloth. Above ground the sun is bright, the air warm, but you're still tasting the dark, the cave, the time, the patient miracle of cheese that waited in shadow to become exactly what it needed to be. You've tasted cheese that aged in darkness for years. Now let's talk about what happened when sugar finally arrived in Europe, and medieval people lost their minds sculpting it into castles. You're at a wedding feast. The meal has been excessive: roasted meats, pies, wine, more meat. Guests are full drowsy, ready for the evening to wind down. Then the servants extinguish half the candles, and in the dimmer light they carry in something that makes everyone gasp. It's a castle. A perfect miniature castle, complete with towers, battlements, tiny windows, even flags, and it's made entirely of sugar. Welcome to the bizarre world of medieval sugar sculpture, where the rarest, most expensive ingredient in Europe was transformed into edible architecture that no one actually wanted to eat. Sugar arrived slowly in medieval Europe, first as medicine sold by apothecaries in tiny quantities, then as a luxury ingredient for the extremely wealthy. It came from the Middle East, transported along trade routes that made it worth more than its weight in silver by the time it reached European markets. Owning sugar meant you had serious money. Displaying sugar meant you wanted everyone to know it. So nobles started commissioning sugar sculptures for their feasts. Not just simple shapes, but elaborate creations, castles, ships, saints' entire biblical scenes. These weren't desserts in any normal sense. They were edible status symbols, art projects made from crystallized wealth. You're watching the sugar artist work now. He's in a specialized kitchen working with heated sugar syrup, molding it, while it's still pliable building structure piece by piece. Sugar sculpture requires timing too hot, and it burns too cool, and it won't hold shape. He's been working on this castle for 3 days, adding details with tweezers and tiny knives, bricks carved into the sugar walls, a portcullis made from pulled sugar threads, a moat of tinted blue sugar representing water. The skill is extraordinary. These artists were specialists travelling from court to court, hired for specific events. They knew techniques that wouldn't be formalized for centuries, how to achieve different textures, how to colour sugar with fruit juices and spices, how to make it shine or stay matte. They were engineers working in a medium that dissolved in humidity and cracked under stress. Historians still argue whether people actually ate these sculptures. Some accounts suggest they were dismantled at the end of feasts and distributed to guests as favours. A chunk of sugar castle was a valuable gift. Other sources imply they were purely decorative, admired, but not consumed, eventually discarded once they started attracting ants. The sculptures got increasingly ambitious. One Venetian feast featured a life-sized sugar lion. A French wedding had an entire nativity scene, Mary, Joseph, baby Jesus, shepherds' animals, all carved from sugar and marzipan. An English court commissioned a sugar replica of the king himself, seated on a sugar throne holding a sugar scepter. The absurdity wasn't lost on contemporary critics. Church officials condemned sugar sculptures as vanity waste and missing the point of hospitality. You're supposed to feed guests, they argued, not show off how much expensive sweetener you can transform into inedible art. Some preachers called it sinful gluttony, not in consumption but in display. But the nobles didn't stop. If anything, criticism made the sculptures more elaborate. They became competitive. Your castle has 3 towers. Mine has 7. Your ship has sugar sails. Mine has working sugar cannons that shoot marzipan balls. The arms race of edible architecture escalated until some sculptures cost more than actual buildings. You're back at the wedding, staring at the sugar castle. It's beautiful, undeniably. The craftsmanship is stunning. But it's also slightly melancholy, all that work, all that expense, and for what? It'll sit on the table for a few hours, be admired, photographed in people's memories, and then disappear. Either eaten in chunks that taste vaguely sweet and entirely wrong for the effort, or tossed to servants who'll break it apart and use it to sweeten their morning porridge for weeks. Medieval people also created marzipan sculptures, ground almonds and sugar paste moulded into shapes. These were slightly more practical because marzipan actually tastes good and has a texture people want to eat. But the same principles applied make it elaborate, make it impressive, make it so expensive that your guests understand your wealth without you saying a word. One recipe book suggests making marzipan shaped like cooked birds, painting them with saffron to look roasted, then serving them as a joke. Guests bite into what they think is meat and discover sweetness instead. It's a prank that cost a fortune to execute, which somehow made it funnier to medieval sensibilities. The sugar sculptures also had a practical problem: they melted. Not always obviously, but humidity would soften them. Heat from candles would warp them. Sugar artists had to factor in room temperature airflow, even the breath of guests standing too close. Some sculptures came with instructions: view from this distance, do not touch, extinguish nearby candles. By the late Middle Ages, sugar was becoming slightly more available, which meant more people could afford small sculptures. The nobility responded by making theirs even more elaborate. If merchants could now have sugar swans, lords needed sugar palaces with working drawbridges. You watch as the wedding guests finally approach the castle. The bride and groom are invited to break off the first piece of tower, which snaps cleanly. They taste it, politely smile, and set it aside. Too sweet, too hard, too much. The sculpture is beautiful, but eating it feels wrong, like destroying art for no good reason. The servants begin dismantling it, carefully wrapping pieces in cloth for guests to take home. You receive a small section of wall. It weighs almost nothing but represents probably a week of your income. You'll keep it, you think. Put it somewhere dry. Show visitors. This is from the castle at the wedding, you'll say, and they'll understand you were there at the table where they served architecture, where wealth was sculpted into temporary beauty, where sugar became something more and less than food. You've held a piece of sugar castle that cost more than your rent. Now let's talk about what happened when the church decided that Christians needed to avoid meat for more than half the year. You're looking at a medieval calendar and someone's marked it up with colours. Red days mean meat. White days mean no meat. There's a lot more white than red. You start counting Lent is 40 days. Every Friday is meatless. Ember days vigils before major saints' feasts Advent. You stop counting around day 150. Welcome to the paradox of medieval fasting, where religious restrictions on eating meat created the most elaborate, expensive and absurd fish feasts in history. The math is staggering. Depending on how strictly you followed church law, you might be forbidden from eating meat for over 180 days per year. That's more than half your life spent technically fasting. Except, fasting became a word that meant something very different for the wealthy than for everyone else. For peasants, meatless days meant what they sound like: no meat. You ate pottage, bread, vegetables, maybe fish if you lived near water or could afford dried herring. It was genuinely restrictive, genuinely a sacrifice. You felt the absence of protein, the missing fat. Fasting meant being hungrier. For nobles, meatless days meant hire better cooks. You're at a Lenten feast in a bishop's palace. The first course arrives 12 different types of fish arranged on platters by size and elaborateness. Pike in sauce, lamprey pie salmon glazed with something sweet sturgeon, the royal fish in saffron cream. This is followed by oysters, mussels, and something the server claims is water beast, which turns out to be that theological loophole porpoise you remember from earlier. The feast continues, more fish, eel, carp. Herring prepared 4 different ways. Fish mousse moulded into the shape of a lamb. That almond milk cheese making another appearance. Pastries filled with fish, and raisins sweet and savoury combined in ways that make you question medieval taste. You're not fasting, you're eating more than you would on a meat day. And everything costs a fortune. Historians still argue whether the church intended this outcome. The original idea was simple: abstain from flesh. As a spiritual discipline, remember, sacrifice focus on prayer instead of pleasure. But what actually happened was that the wealthy turned Lenten restrictions into competitive displays of how many expensive fish you could serve. Account books from noble households show Lenten food budgets that exceeded normal weeks. Fish was expensive, especially inland where it had to be transported live or preserved. Freshwater fish from managed ponds cost less than ocean fish, but both were pricier than chicken or pork. So by forcing people to eat fish, the church inadvertently created a situation where fasting cost more than feasting. The fish trade exploded. Entire industries developed around preserving and transporting fish. Herring was salted and barreled by the millions. Cod was dried on racks until it became hard as wood. Salmon was smoked. Monasteries built elaborate fish pond systems, some with dozens of connected ponds, where different species were raised, sorted by size and quality. You're watching monks manage their fish ponds now. They're harvesting carp, thick, muddy-tasting fish that were nevertheless prized because they grew large and survived winter. The monks net them carefully, sort them into baskets. The biggest go to the monastery table. Medium ones are sold to nearby nobles. Small ones are returned to grow another season. These pond systems were engineering marvels. Monks designed them with overflow channels, feeding systems, even seasonal flooding to enrich the water. Some monasteries became known for their fish quality. A carp from such and such abbey was guaranteed fresh, well-fed, worth the premium price. But even with all this infrastructure, demand exceeded supply during Lent. Prices spiked. Fish merchants made their entire year's profit in those 40 days. Some years fish riots broke out in cities when supplies ran low and prices became extortionate. People literally fought over access to Lent-legal protein. The strangest part was watching people justify increasingly absurd interpretations. Barnacle geese birds that nested in the Arctic where medieval Europeans never saw them were declared fish because legend said they hatched from barnacles, therefore goose during Lent. Beavers were fish because of their flat tails. Puffins were fish because they spent time in water. The logic was tortured, but the appetite for loopholes was insatiable. Church authorities occasionally pushed back. Some bishops issued stern reminders that Lent was supposed to be simple, humble, sacrificial. But enforcement was impossible. How do you tell a noble he's fasting wrong when he's technically following the rules? He's eating fish. The fish just happens to be dolphin served in almond cream with sugar and imported spices. You're back at that Lenten feast. The final course arrives, a massive sturgeon whole glazed and decorated. It's been paraded through the hall to applause before being carved. The meat is firm, mild, expensive beyond belief. You eat it feeling both full and fraudulent. This is fasting. The real cost of these feast fasts went beyond money. Entire fisheries were depleted. Herring populations crashed from overfishing. Salmon runs were blocked by mill dams and fish traps. The Church's dietary laws combined with medieval population growth created genuine environmental pressure on aquatic ecosystems. Meanwhile, peasants ate their dried herring, tough salty the same fish for every meatless meal, and wondered if God really cared whether your Friday protein was finned or legged, or if the whole system had become something else entirely. One medieval writer noted sarcastically that rich men's fasts were poor men's feasts. Another observed that Lent had become the season when the wealthy proved they could spend more on fish than most people earned in months. The criticism was valid but ineffective. The system continued because everyone involved benefited the Church, maintained authority over diet nobles had new opportunities for competitive display, and fish merchants became wealthy middlemen in salvation. You leave the feast stomach heavy with luxury fish. Outside the sun sets over Lent. Somewhere someone is eating plain herring for the 40th day in a row and calling it sacrifice. Somewhere else a fish merchant counts his coins, and in between the Church preaches about humility while blessing sturgeon. You've watched nobles spend fortunes on fish they pretended was fasting. Now let's talk about the liquids they poured over everything to make medieval meat taste like something other than medieval meat. Sauces. You're in a kitchen watching a cook prepare cameline, one of the most popular sauces in medieval Europe. He's grinding cinnamon, ginger, cloves and pepper in a mortar. Then he adds breadcrumbs soaked in vinegar and wine. The mixture turns rust-coloured thick, and when you smell it, your sinuses clear immediately. It's sharp, spiced, aggressive. This is what you'll pour over roasted meat tonight. Welcome to medieval sauce culture, where the goal wasn't to enhance flavour, it was to overpower it completely. Medieval sauces were acid bombs. Vinegar verjuice sour juice pressed from unripe grapes, wine, citrus when available. The base was always something that made your mouth pucker. Then came spices, lots of them ground fine and mixed until the sauce had the consistency of thin paste. Sugar sometimes appeared to balance the acid, but the overall effect was always intense, always dominating whatever you poured it on. Why so much acid and spice? Historians still argue, but the most common theory is preservation. Meat in the Middle Ages was often on the edge of spoiling. There was no refrigeration. Animals were slaughtered, butchered, and either eaten immediately or preserved with salt. Even fresh meat might be several days old, especially if it came from market. Acidic, heavily spiced sauces masked off flavours and may have provided some antibacterial effect through vinegar and certain spices. But there's another theory: medieval people genuinely liked these flavours. They weren't trying to hide bad meat, they preferred the sharp, complex taste of heavily sauced food. Their palates were different, adapted to preserved foods, fermented flavours and intense spicing. What taste overwhelming to modern tongues might have been perfectly balanced to theirs. You taste a spoonful of the cameline. It's a lot. The cinnamon hits first, then the ginger heat, then the vinegar acidity that makes your jaw clench. You can't imagine putting this on food, it would obliterate any subtle flavour. But the cook nods approvingly. This is good cameline, strong, proper. Another popular sauce was green sauce, herbs, garlic vinegar, sometimes verjuice all pounded into a bright green paste. It accompanied fish poultry, sometimes vegetables. The colour was important. Medieval diners expected visual variety. A plate should have multiple colours, multiple textures. The sauce wasn't just flavouring, it was part of the aesthetic. Then there was garam's medieval descendants. Garum fermented fish sauce was everywhere in Roman cuisine. By the Middle Ages it had mostly disappeared from European tables, replaced by similar but distinct fish-based liquids. Fermented herring, brine, anchovy paste mixed into sauces, various unidentifiable fish waters that showed up in recipes without clear explanation. These added umami before anyone had a word for umami. They made sauces savoury, complex, slightly funky. You wouldn't eat them alone, the smell would discourage you, but mixed into a sauce with vinegar and spices they created depth that acid and sweet alone couldn't achieve. You're watching the cook prepare multiple sauces now. Medieval meals for wealthy diners required options. The table would have 3 or 4 different sauces, and guests could choose based on preference or health concerns. Remember those humours. Medieval medical theory held that different foods and sauces affected your body's balance of hot, cold, wet, and dry. Choosing the right sauce wasn't just taste, it was healthcare. Mustard appeared too, but not the smooth yellow paste you might know. Medieval mustard was grainy, mixed, fresh, often combined with honey or wine. It was served with particular meats, pork especially, and in such quantities that some recipes are essentially meat floating in mustard, rather than mustard accompanying meat. The most elaborate sauce was probably jants, a complicated mixture involving chicken broth, almond milk, ginger sugar, and white wine. It was pale, almost translucent, meant to show that you could afford expensive white ingredients. Visually, it contrasted with the dark meat sauces. Symbolically, it showed wealth. Practically, it tasted like spiced alcoholic cream and probably made everything slightly gooey. What's striking about medieval sauces is how many ingredients went into them. A single sauce might have 8 or 9 components, each expensive, each requiring preparation. Making camelin meant having cinnamon from Ceylon ginger, from India pepper from the Malabar coast, wine from your vineyard, vinegar from somewhere. Creating these sauces was displaying your trade connections as much as your culinary skill. Peasant sauces existed too, though they rarely made it into written recipes. Simple herb and vinegar combinations. Onion sauce, essentially minced onions in ale or water. Garlic paste with salt. These weren't sophisticated, but they served the same purpose, adding strong flavour to bland or questionable meat. You're at dinner now, watching guests navigate the sauce selection. The host explains each one, mentioning ingredients suggesting pairings. The camel-coloured cameline goes with beef. The bright green sauce accompanies the fish course. The pale jants is for the final poultry. You're supposed to mix and match, experiment, find combinations you prefer. You try the beef with cameline. The sauce completely dominates. You can barely taste the meat. It's just a vehicle for cinnamon, vinegar, and ginger. You try a second bite without sauce. The meat is bland, slightly tough. With sauce, at least it's interesting, even if interesting means your mouth is under assault. This was medieval flavour philosophy. More is more. Subtle was boring. Complex meant throwing everything valuable into a mortar and grinding until you created something that fought back when you ate it. Food should be challenging, surprising, never bland. The meal ends with your tongue slightly numb from spice and acid. Every dish tasted more like its sauce than itself. The chicken tasted like jants. The fish tasted like green sauce. The beef tasted like cameline. You remember the sauces, not the meats. Which perhaps was the point. In a world where meat quality varied wildly, where preservation was uncertain, where subtle flavours were impossible to guarantee, the solution was to make everything taste like the one thing you could control: the sauce you mixed fresh that morning with spices you imported specifically for their intensity with vinegar. You trusted with flavours that announced loudly, aggressively that you knew what you were doing. You've tasted sauces that burned away your ability to taste anything else. Now let's talk about what happens when medieval cooks decided that reality was boring and animals should be combined. The cockatrice. You're in a noble kitchen on the morning of a major feast. 2 cooks are working on something that makes you question their sanity. They've roasted a pig normal so far and a capon also normal, but now they're cutting each animal in half. Not lengthwise, crosswise, through the middle, They're taking the front half of the pig and sewing it to the back half of the chicken, and the front half of the chicken to the back half of the pig. Welcome to medieval fusion cuisine, where fusion meant literally stitching incompatible animals together and serving them as entertainment. The cockentrice wasn't just weird for the sake of weird. It was a statement. It said, we have so much food, so much skill, so much time, that we can perform surgery on dinner. It was culinary taxidermy meeting Frankenstein centuries before Mary Shelley would write about stitching things together that nature never intended. The process was meticulous. First, both animals were roasted separately because pig and chicken required different cooking times and temperatures. You couldn't just stitch raw animals together and hope for the best. Once cooked, they were carefully butchered at the precise middle point. The cook is measuring, making sure the halves will align when sewn. Then came the assembly. Using thick thread, sometimes wire, the front half of the pig was attached to the rear half of the chicken. The seam had to be neat because everyone would see it. Some cooks tried to hide the joint with pastry or sauce, but the best cockentrices displayed the seam proudly. Look at this impossible thing we made. You're watching them work now. The pig's front end head, shoulders, front legs connects to the chicken's rear wings, back drumsticks. It looks wrong. Your brain rejects it. That combination doesn't walk, doesn't fly, doesn't exist in nature, which is exactly why it exists on this platter. The second creature is equally disturbing: chicken head and breast attached to pig haunches and curly tail. It's smaller somehow, more pathetic. A bird that ends in pork, an identity crisis you can carve. Historians still argue about the symbolism. Some suggest the cockentrice represented the union of land and air, earthly and heavenly natures combined. Others think it was just medieval nobles being weird because they could afford to be. Both might be true. The name itself is disputed. Cockentrice might derive from cockatrice, a mythical creature that was part rooster, part serpent. The culinary version substituted pig for serpent, probably because serpent was hard to source, and pig was delicious. Other regions called it à la crêce, or two-in-one, which was at least descriptive if not poetic. Recipe books treat cockentrice construction as advanced technique. One 14th century text suggests stuffing the cavity where the animals join with spiced forcemeat to help hold everything together and add flavour. Another recommends glazing the entire creation with egg yolk and saffron so it glows golden and looks even more unnatural. Some cooks went further. They created 3 animal combinations: front of a goose, middle of a pig, rear of a lamb. These were called tripatrices, or sometimes just mistakes, depending on who was describing them. The engineering challenges were significant. How do you make 3 different animals, each with different bone structures and flesh densities, look like a single, coherent creature? You don't really. You make something that looks like a nightmare someone tried to eat. But at feasts, cockentrices were celebrated. They'd be carried in with ceremony, placed prominently on the high table. Guests would applaud the audacity. The cook would receive compliments, and then someone had to carve it. You're watching this happen now. The carver approaches cautiously. Where do you start? The pig head or the chicken legs? He chooses the middle, cutting through the seam where pig becomes poultry. The meat falls apart slightly. The stitching only did so much. Guests receive portions, some get pig front, others get chicken back. You get a piece from the joint, a bit of both the worst of both worlds, tough pig shoulder mixed with overcooked chicken thigh. It tastes like meat. All the elaborate construction, the hours of work, the impossible creature, and it just tastes like pig and chicken. Not better than either would be alone. Probably worse, because both animals sat around getting cold while being sewn together, then reheated, then displayed. This is the cockentrice paradox: maximum effort for minimal payoff. The spectacle was everything. The actual eating was almost beside the point. Some households went even more elaborate. They'd create entire menageries of impossible animals: swans with fishtails, rabbits with bird wings, deer with pig legs. Feasts became bizarre zoos of culinary fiction. Tables covered with creatures that never existed except in some cook's exhausted imagination. The practice faded by the late Middle Ages. Fashion moved on. Perhaps people got tired of eating stitched monsters. Perhaps cooks rebelled against spending days on projects that mostly impressed other cooks. Or perhaps the nobility found new ways to display wealth that didn't require giving their dinner an existential crisis. You finish your portion of cockentrice. Your plate has both pig bristles and feathers on it, which feels wrong. The meat is fine, not bad, not great, just protein that went through an unnecessary ordeal before reaching your mouth. The kitchen staff is already planning next feast creation. Someone suggests a fish head on a lamb body. Another proposes a peacock with pig wings. The head cook looks tired. He's made dozens of these abominations. He knows they'll keep making them as long as nobles keep requesting them, as long as impossibility remains impressive, as long as dinner needs to be more than dinner. Outside, real pigs and chickens go about their lives blissfully unaware that somewhere their species are being combined into creatures that defy taxonomy theology and taste all, so a rich man can point at his plate and say, "Look at this ridiculous thing I can afford." You've eaten animals stitched together for no good reason. Now let's talk about what people ate when all the reasonable food ran out, and survival required creativity, desperation, and occasionally consuming your own house. Famine bread. You're standing in a village during a crop failure. The wheat harvest failed: too much rain, then blight. The rye is sparse. Barley was eaten months ago. The storage barns are empty except for mice, and people have started eating those too. But you still need bread. Somehow. Welcome to the darkest corner of medieval cuisine, where bread became a category that included things you wouldn't feed to enemies, and where the line between food and not food dissolved under the weight of hunger. The first substitution was predictable. When you run out of wheat, you use other grains. Oats, which were usually for horses. Millet, which was animal feed. These made poor bread dense, bitter, hard to digest, but they were still plants, still grains, still recognizable as food adjacent. But when those ran out, things got creative in ways that make your stomach turn centuries later. Acorns! You're watching people gather acorns from the oak forest. Normally these go to pigs, but there are no pigs anymore. They were slaughtered when it became clear there wouldn't be enough to feed them. So the acorns get collected, shelled, then soaked for days in multiple changes of water to leach out the tannins that make them bitter and toxic. After soaking, they're dried and ground into flour. Acorn flour is brownish grey, smells slightly musty, and makes bread that's dense as stone and tastes like the forest floor. But it's calories, it's bulk. It fills your stomach even if it doesn't satisfy hunger. Mixed with whatever small amount of grain flour remains, acorn bread is survivable. Pure acorn bread is punishment. You eat it slowly, chewing carefully, because it's tough enough to hurt your teeth. Children cry when they're given it. Adults eat in silence, trying not to think about what they're consuming, but acorns are luxury compared to what comes next. Bark bread. The inner bark of certain trees, pine, birch, elm, can be stripped, dried, and ground into flour. It's fibrous, woody, nearly flavourless. It has almost no nutritional value, but it has mass. You can mix it with water and small amounts of real flour, bake it into something bread-shaped, and eat it. You're holding a piece of bark bread now. Its pale, slightly grainy looks almost normal if you don't examine closely. You bite into it. It's simultaneously hard and chewy, like eating compressed sawdust held together by hope. Your jaw works, but the bread doesn't break down properly. You swallow what you can, your throat protests. Medieval chronicles mention bark bread during the worst famines. One writer describes people stripping entire groves of birch trees, leaving them to die, because the choice was between trees and people people needed to eat something. Another account mentions a village that ate all the bark they could reach, then started on the roots, then finally abandoned the settlement because there was nothing left to consume. Some regions developed names for these starvation foods. Tree bread was too honest, too bleak, so it became poverty loaves or forest bread phrases that tried to make desperation sound pastoral. The strangest substitutions involved clay. Yes, clay. Certain types of white clay, when mixed with tiny amounts of grain and water, could be baked into bread-shaped objects that filled your stomach. They had no calories, no nutrition whatsoever. But they created the sensation of fullness, briefly tricking your body into thinking it had eaten. People died from clay bread. Their intestines would become blocked, impacted. But in the moment it stopped the hunger pangs. For a few hours you felt less empty. That was worth the risk when the alternative was feeling the emptiness constantly. You're in a cottage where someone is mixing clay bread. The woman doesn't meet your eyes. This is shame food beyond shame. She's baking earth because her children are crying from hunger. The dough is greyish, wet, heavy. It goes into the oven. It comes out looking bread-like. The children eat it eagerly because they don't know better. She eats it knowing exactly what it is. Medieval texts also mention famine cakes, made from ground grass seeds, from fern roots, from things that had never been considered food before. Some of these were marginally nutritious. Others were just bulk that could be chewed and swallowed. The social breakdown around famine food was documented by chroniclers. People stopped sharing recipes because sharing meant admitting what you were eating. Communities fragmented because there wasn't enough food to maintain bonds. The rituals around bread, breaking it together, blessing it, using it for trenchers, all disappeared when bread stopped being recognizable. One account describes beard bread, named either because it looked hairy from the grass seeds mixed in, or because grown men wept while eating it, their beards wet with tears. The writer doesn't specify which, and maybe both were true. The aftermath of famine shows up in other records, mass migrations, as people abandoned regions where the land had failed, population crashes that took generations to recover from, and psychological scars documented in chronicles, where survivors describe never feeling safe about food again, even years later. You're watching someone eat bark bread now. They chew methodically, showing no emotion. This is survival stripped of everything that makes eating human no pleasure, no fellowship, no comfort. Just the mechanical process of putting something into your mouth that might keep you alive another day. Medieval people named these foods carefully. They didn't call them starvation bread while they were eating them. They used softer terms, euphemisms that created distance from the horror. But later in chronicles written after the famines ended, the honest names appear: desperation, bread, death loaves the bread of tears. And always the writer's note, when real grain finally became available again, people wept while eating actual bread. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of tasting food that was meant to be food that nourished rather than just filled, that reminded them they were human beings who deserved better than eating trees. You've tasted bark and clay shaped like bread. Now, as the night deepens and your eyelids grow heavy, let's talk about the one meal that ties everything together. The memory of warmth. The final feast. The quiet moment when strange foods became something more than survival. You're sitting by a fire now. Not the roaring blaze of a great hall, but a small hearth in an ordinary home. The kind of fire that medieval people knew best contained precious tended carefully, because letting it die meant work and cold and darkness. Someone is preparing a simple meal, not peacocks or dolphins or cockentrices, not sugar castles or bark bread, just food. A pot of something warm, bread that's actual bread, maybe cheese, perhaps a cup of ale or watered wine. And in this moment you understand something. The statistics and recipes never quite capture. Medieval eating wasn't really about the strange meals, it was about this. The quiet evenings, the shared bowl, the knowledge that tomorrow you'd probably eat something similar, and that was fine, that was life, that was enough. The strange meals, the lampreys that killed kings, the bird pies that sang the wail that fed a village, those were exceptions. Memorable, because they were rare. But most medieval people most of the time ate simply. They ate what was available, what the season provided, what the community could share. Your strange journey through medieval cuisine has been real. Every bizarre dish existed, was documented, was consumed by actual people. But those people also ate thousands of unremarkable meals in between. Bread and cheese, pottage again, an apple from the tree, a handful of nuts. The hippocras and the fake eggs and the stitched animals existed in the space between survival and celebration, where humans do what they've always done. Try to make eating mean something beyond hunger, where food becomes art, becomes theatre, becomes prayer, becomes proof of wealth, or piety, or creativity, or simple human stubbornness. Think about the monk tending his cheese in the dark cave. He's not just preserving food, he's creating continuity, practicing patience, believing in a future where the cheese will be perfect and people will taste his care in every bite. Think about the family gathered around their eternal pottage pot. They're not just eating, they're participating in a ritual older than memory, the shared bowl that makes them family, the fire that keeps them alive, the small miracle of having something warm when the world outside is cold and uncertain. Even the bark bread, horrible as it was, represents something profound. People faced with nothing still tried to make bread. They could have given up the form eaten anything, however it came. But they ground and mixed and baked, because bread meant civilization, meant humanity, meant you hadn't surrendered everything yet. The strange meals were never just about the food. They were about sending messages. I can afford this. I understand classical texts. I follow religious law. I can make the impossible appear on a platter. I survived another winter. I found a way to feed my children. I remember to pray before eating. I still know how to be grateful. You taste whatever's in the bowl by this small fire. It's warm. It's simple. It tastes like safety, like home, like the ordinary miracle of having enough. Medieval people understood something. We've partly forgotten that eating is always intimate, always vulnerable, always an act of trust. You trust the cook, the farmer, the animals, the soil, the season. You trust that what you're putting in your mouth won't kill you. You trust that tomorrow there will be something else to eat. Sometimes that trust was rewarded with feasts and plenty. Sometimes it was betrayed by famine and failure. But the eating continued. The fires burned, the pots simmered, and people found ways, strange, creative, desperate, bizarre ways to keep feeding themselves and each other. The candle beside you is guttering now. It's made from tallow animal fat, the practical, everyday kind, not the expensive beeswax. It smells slightly of sheep smokes a bit, gives just enough light to see by. Medieval light, medieval smell, medieval life, which was mostly ordinary, occasionally terrible, sometimes surprisingly beautiful. Outside the night is complete. The kind of darkness modern people rarely experience, where the world beyond your fire ceases to exist, where the warmth of the hearth and the food in your bowl define reality. You think about everything you've learned tonight. The peacocks in their own feathers, the dolphins called fish, the birds escaping from pies, the trenchers feeding the poor, the dormice stuffed with nuts, the hedgehogs wrapped in clay, the whale on the beach, the fake eggs, the hippocras, the pottage, the squirrels and crows, the cheese aging in darkness, the sugar castles, the impossible fish feasts, the sauces that burned, the stitched monsters, the bark and clay shaped into bread. All of it real, all of it strange, all of it human. The fire settles lower, the meal is finished, your body is warm and fed, your mind is full of impossible dinners, and the people who made them ate them, survived them, remembered them. This is what medieval eating really was, not a list of weird ingredients, but a relationship with uncertainty. You didn't know if the harvest would succeed. You didn't know if the whale would beach. You didn't know if you'd be eating peacock or bark by year's end. So you adapted. You found humour in the absurd meaning in the ritual community in the shared meal, and hope in the simple fact that today at least there was something to eat. The last ember glows red beneath the ash. Tomorrow will bring whatever it brings, ordinary bread or strange necessity. But tonight the story is complete. The medieval kitchen grows quiet. The fires bank low. The feasts and famines fade into memory, into history, into the long sleep of centuries. And somewhere in the space between waking and dreams, you can almost taste it, the smoke, the spices, the survival, the strangeness of it all. Good night. The story ends here. See you in the next video. Good night.